We are joined now by Dr. Sandra Stotsky. Dr. Stotsky, you are one of the foremost authorities on language and learning for public schools in the world, I would say, and we've talked to you many times before. And so I wanted to start a conversation today about the teachers' unions. We're going to go in a couple different directions here, but I think that the average mom and dad at home, they have no idea how much power teachers' unions have. They also, many of them, I think, falsely believe that because they're a teachers' union, that they have the best educational interests of the child at stake, at heart. Talk a little bit about, in your experience, your long experience, talk about where did the teachers' unions come from? What are they good at and what are they bad at? And ultimately, what do they want?
Like all unions, they were interested originally, we thought, in teacher salaries and working conditions. And the curriculum was still something that teachers and education schools were more interested in. So how the teacher union influence on the school curriculum got developed and established is still, to me, a bit of a mystery, because we cannot see that they have, aside from what Al Shanker with his New York City union was doing, we do not know that there is anything with the curriculum itself in K-12 that teachers' unions have really helped us to strengthen, which is what we thought we wanted to do for all kids. What do you think?
Well, I wanted to ask you this related to this. I think you're exactly right, but it's deeper than that. When did promoting teachers' working conditions, which I don't think a lot of people have a problem with, like anybody else, we want to make sure our teachers have a conducive environment. We want to make sure that kids have checks and controls over them, over beyond the classroom. But when did unions, in your estimation, start cutting back or demanding cutbacks to accountability? It seems to me that the modern teachers union, they have two purposes. One is to demand more money without any results to back that up. No matter how poorly the kids perform, give us more money, number one. And number two, the unions seem to be hell-bent on eroding what actual accountability methods there are. So it's never the teacher's fault. We can never hold teachers accountable. We can never ask more of teachers. When teachers cannot educate their kids, or heaven forbid, when teachers get themselves in situations where they're in serious trouble for having perhaps sexual relationships with some of their children, none of this results in the firing of a teacher anymore. How did we get to this place?
It's true with the people who work in a variety of our public institutions. Happens with librarians as well, as I discovered because I was on the library board in my town for over 14 years. But back to teachers, I think it was sometime well after World War II, sometime in the 70s or 80s, when teachers began to take control of what they thought was happening because of their principals or headmasters or the people who ran the schools or who funded the schools. So accountability changed to protect the teachers. And it's very difficult, as you know, to fire a teacher today for any purpose. The other thing I want to make sure we get in is that even in the ed schools itself or higher education, the unions have unionized teacher educators as well. So we don't have a way to neutralize what the teachers in the schools do, except that they pick up from older teachers what they think they should do in the classes. And somehow the older teachers do in the elementary school what seems to be best for them. High school is a bit different because teachers come from academic majors for the most part in high school and don't have the exposure to in teacher training or student teaching that the elementary teacher in K through 5 or 6 typically has. What do you think?
I think you're exactly right. And I think when you've got a system where the unions make it impossible for teachers who want to buck the system to do it, it seems to me that over the last 10 years, even over the Common Core era, that we've seen for the last 10 or 12 years, where you've been out on the front line fighting, I have as well, it seems that the teachers' unions have locked down the classrooms even more. And in many instances, they seem to be working against the teachers, that they're taking ideological and pedagogical advice from textbook companies, from educrats, from social engineers like David Coleman, who created the Common Core scheme, but they're not listening to teachers. When did the union throw its weight behind sociological education reform used to emotionally and socially change kids over pedagogies that actually worked in terms of learning more knowledge-based stuff?
I think we have to start, number one, by questioning whether the teacher unions are more concerned about what students learn than about protecting teachers' rights to teach and making sure that they have teachers coming into the system who reflect the union movement. I can only talk on the basis of what I see in my home community, and the teachers union is very prominent in protecting teachers. When it became an issue about who was to protect a teacher, who was being charged with whatever, it seemed that the union was there to make sure that it was not a case of civil rights, so or to protect the teacher in some way, and so that accountability couldn't be allowed to play a role for what students were learning if you had teachers who were not accountable for their learning. There were other things, the support of the community, more money, and money was, of course, the raison d'etre for a union. So I would say that you have what you think may have been only in the past 10 years. I think it goes back 30 to 40 years to when we had larger social movements in this country that focused on what teachers needed as opposed to what students needed. And the schools have never recovered the parent influence that was there in small towns or cities, which were dependent upon local taxes. Once you had the US government, the federal government, and the state government providing a lot of money for the schools, there was no more, there was less and less power for parents who were concerned about what their children were learning. How do you see the education requirements for students changing in this country, which is where I've been mainly concerned, and what my real reforms were when I was in the Massachusetts Department of Education?
Well, I teach at a university, and I teach a lot of education majors, because if you want to be a high school English teacher in Wisconsin, you have to take Shakespeare, because Shakespeare is one of the few classical texts that's left in the curriculum. So I get all the education majors that are secondary ed English, and it's the same story again and again. They lament the fact that every class they take in education has become the same class. They're not learning pedagogies. They're actually being told to back off, and let the schools, let the textbooks, let the curriculum specialists tell you what you can do and can't do. So they're being backed down off of all the original things, all the creative things that good teachers used to do, and they're being told now it's all the same kind of ideology. I had one student who complained she spent money on 4 different classes. She had to take 12 as an education major, 4 different classes, and it was the same culture. It was the same course in multiculturalism, which she said was anti-Western bias, right? That again and again and again, in the books that she was to teach, in the attitude she was to take to literature, she had it drilled into her head 4 different classes that multicultural means expose kids to the greater achievements of non-Western cultures, while simultaneously holding Western culture accountable exclusively for race, class, and gender and colonization.
Well, what you're showing is that the ideology was coming through in the teacher education programs, but that was beginning several decades ago. It's not just the acceleration of ideological influence, which we see in the last 10 years. It really goes back many decades, because I was a parent several decades ago with 5 children in my local public schools, and I watched what changed over the course of, say, 20 years from the time my first child started and my last child completed. And you had various different influences, and any teachers who were deviants, who reflected an older school of thought, were simply not shouted down, but they weren't supported by anything else in the curriculum, because the curriculum was coming from textbooks, other materials, and professional development, which we saw being totally controlled by outside ideological forces. And a lot of that was the concern, jumping back to 65 and 66, when the federal government, with ESEA, which was in 1965 under LBJ's presidential administration, you had the concern for poor kids, and people in education were obsessed about what they could do with the education of poor children to close what they did, the gaps, even though they didn't call it the gaps in those days. They simply called it low achievement. But that was the beginning of the end for any focus on what we wanted kids to really learn and be able to do in terms of high achievement. It wasn't that way under Sputnik, which was a decade earlier. And the Sputnik era programs only lasted for about 10 years or so. And then we had a total switch to which is still continuing today, even though we have a recent Brookings article by an economist who understands education about what is now going to happen. And they're not sure. They just know that nothing has worked in recent decades to address the low achievers, but it's the focus on low achievement that has hurt the schools, and the need to get teacher in ed school teacher prep programs, wherever they could come from, and wherever you could get professional development providers, PD providers, to emphasize and continue. That there is where you see the change in how to get teachers to focus on lifting up the bottom, but not aiming for the top, which is what almost any good educator used to do years ago. They lifted the bottom by aiming for the top. It's hard to find anyone to even understand what that means anymore, because we have such a change.
Well, one of the big problem is that, and I think this is the difference over the last 10 or 12 years. I agree with you. This started a lot longer ago than the last 10 years. But one of the changes in the last 10, 12 years is not just to ignore the high achievers, but to actually attack them as being guilty of privilege, right? So now it's not just we're not going to teach the highest students, we're not going to encourage excellence. We're going to target those kids. We're going to make those kids who can do, we're going to heap them with racial and sociological injustice. They're not better than the kids who don't perform. They've just had privilege. So you're systematically not just ignoring the high achievers, you are to some degree turning them into pariahs as you tout. So you don't try to fix the bottom. The bottom is fine. The bottom doesn't need help. What we have to do is adjust the high achievers down. That seems to be where we've gone in the last 10 years. I'll give you the last word on that.
I think you're right about that being the focus of teachers' attention, and they have to be trained to think that way in education schools, because many years ago, yes, they started by thinking about how the pairing of children in projects could help the low achiever, because I used to get this kind of feedback from my own children. they were being, as able readers, they were being, quotes, used or manipulated to help whoever they were paired with, which was typically a lower performing child. And as a result, they learned very little. That has now morphed to something that is malevolent, which is the notion of white privilege. Because in school systems that did not have much diversity in terms of the color of the child, they had to figure out how income could substitute for diversity, or where it was possible, how ethnicity could substitute for diversity if you couldn't use color as the basis for pairing kids. But one got rid of, quotes, homogeneous groupings, and you had small group work chosen by the teacher. Children were not allowed to choose the partners they were to work with. I can remember how these things began creeping into the elementary school curriculum, but they couldn't tackle the high school very much because you had these individual courses tailored in each subject to different levels of knowledge. It still is a problem for ideologues. They can make all kinds of changes in K through 8, but the hurdle of 9-12 becomes almost insuperable. And that is why in this latest Brookings article by an economist who was looking at, through his research firm on education research, results over the last half century or more, they're now seeing that the teachers can make the difference, which goes back to the Coleman report of 1966, I'm sorry. But where do you go with that? Even if you select teachers, there are parents paying the bills in most small towns where you still have more traditional teaching taking place, not in our cities, which have been drastically changed. What is to happen with the more able learners when you have these differences still there, as we know from the latest scores, even with TIMSS, the International Math and Social Science or Social Science Studies. The names have changed for TIMS, but what they show is that the gaps between the median may not change much, but the gaps get wider. The top gets higher. Good learners continue to learn. Faster learners learn more, and slower learners have learned less. They don't know what to do. And I'm afraid we haven't solved that problem. It's just getting worse.
It is. And we're out of time for this segment, but I want to wish you happy holidays, Sandy. And after the new year, we'll get together and have another conversation.